In October 1899, the British Empire went to war with the two tiny agrarian Boer republics of Orange Free State and Transvaal. On paper, it seemed like a mismatch contest. The entire economic and military might of the British Empire would be pitted against two tiny nations whose population barely numbered that of any major British city, and who did not even possess a formal standing army. Against this, the British Army, a force which had known almost nothing but unbroken success in colonial conflicts, would be pitted. The British Army's advantages lay in its technological superiority. Foes such as the Zulus, the Afghans, the Mahdists and many others might be able to win small victories or local victories through their courage and determination, but ultimately they could not overcome the technological advantage possessed by the British Army. And no greater indication of this technological mismatch can be given than the example of the Battle of Omdurman, fought in September 1898. At this battle, some 50,000 Mahdists streamed across an open plain to assault a British line. The results were predictable. The firepower of the British was dominating. By the end of the day, the Mahdists had suffered 23,000 casualties for no gain. By comparison, the British lost 47 men killed and 382 wounded. Yet the Boers were not the Mahdists or the Zulus. They were something entirely different. Indeed, they had already proved their mettle in earlier conflicts, for they had emerged victorious from the First Boer War of 1880 to 81, fought against the British, a war that had culminated at the Battle of Magersfontein Hill, where a British army was humiliatingly defeated by the Boers, leading to a political compromise that ensured independence for Transvaal, an Orange Free State. Yet aside from a few forward-thinking officers in the British Army, this experience was neglected. This was a serious error. Although the Boers did not possess a standing army, they did have a rifle culture that saw guns as both a means and a metaphor for independence. Target shooting was immensely popular within South Africa, and one British journalist compared its popularity to that of billiards in the United Kingdom. In the wake of the abortive Jameson Raid of 1895, the governments of Transvaal and Orange Free State had decided that war with Britain was almost certainly inevitable. Therefore, a decision was made to import large numbers of Mauser rifles from Germany for distribution to the population. When war came in 1899, therefore, the average Boer was at least as well armed as his British counterpart, and due to the rifle culture that had existed before the conflict, was often a better marksman than the British infantryman's equivalent. Furthermore, the Boers were not merely heavily armed, they were also exceptionally mobile. The vast distances and limited infrastructure in South Africa meant the horse was the prime means of transport. Most Boers owned at least one horse, and in times of war, the government would provide one for those who were lacking. The ponies favoured by the Boers were swift, hardy, and were able to survive on limited amounts of forage. Furthermore, they possessed tremendous endurance that would provide a source of wonderment to the British Army. Taken together, these two factors meant that the Boers were both heavily armed and highly mobile. Though they lacked formal training, they had the advantage, fighting in defence of their homeland and across terrain which they knew well. Some indication of the formidable skills of these men may be given by the fact that Winston Churchill, a journalist in the Boer War, chose the Boer word for their military units, commando, and applied it to Britain's own newly formed special forces in 1940. The combination of attributes possessed by the Boers was quite unlike anything the British Army had faced up until this point, and it should have given its planners reason for caution. That it did not was due to a combination of hubris and willful ignorance. On the eve of the war, British military intelligence bizarrely concluded that the Boers of 1899 were a lesser threat than they had been in 1880, despite the fact that the Boers were now more numerous and better armed. The opening of the war should have gone some way to dispelling these uneasy ideas. The Boers understood that they had a limited window of opportunity in which to strike before overwhelming reinforcements arrived from Britain. Therefore, they had to take the fight to the British, win quick victories that would hopefully force the government to the negotiating table. As such, in October, they immediately invaded British-held South Africa, laying siege to the border towns of Mafeking and the diamond mining centre at Kimberley. Worse still, the Boers inflicted a startling battlefield defeat on the British Army at the Battle of Ladysmith, fought on the 30th of October. Therefore, the main British Army operating in South Africa at the beginning of the war stumbled back in retreat into the town of Ladysmith and became besieged. The scale of the Boers' victories at this stage should not be underestimated. In less than a month, they had rampaged through northern Natal, trapped the main British army in Ladysmith and were poised to advance into Cape Colony against negligible British garrison forces. The British government in South Africa was stunned by the speed of the Boers' movements and terrified that the normally reticent Boer population of Cape Colony would erupt in open rebellion and join their brothers in arms as they advanced further south. The dreams of a short, victorious war were swiftly fading. Yet there was hope in the British position, for reinforcements were arriving. Fresh from England came a full-strength army corps, 47,000 men in total, under the command of General Redvers Buller VC. Buller was 59 years old and a highly experienced veteran. He had won the Victoria Cross in the Zulu War in 1879, and he knew South Africa and the Boers who he had fought alongside in this conflict well. His reputation, his fatherly bearing, and his care for the comforts of his soldiers made him a hero to the army. Yet there were doubts about his ability to mount a campaign against a foe as active and dangerous as the Boers. By his own admission, age was catching up with Redvers Buller. Years of sedentary work at the War Office had robbed him of his once muscular frame, and he had begun to assume corpulent proportions. The Boers christened him as General Rubull, Red Bull, mocking his girth and ruddy complexion. Buller's original plan had been that the British army based at Ladysmith would delay the Boers long enough for him to assemble his army corps as a single, decisive striking force. Once assembled, Buller would lead the army corps into an invasion of Boer territory aimed at the war capitals of Bloemfontein and Pretoria. But this sensible plan had been derailed by the early victories the Boers had won in the conflict. Buller now faced a military conundrum. Mafeking and Kimberley were besieged, the British army was trapped at Ladysmith, and the Boers were raiding into Cape Colony with impunity. Faced with such a multitude of problems and a terrific political pressure to wrest the initiative from the seemingly rampant Boers, Buller decided his best option was to split his army corps into 3 separate forces, each tasked with a different mission. The men Buller had selected as commanders of the relief forces were soldiers with proven track records. In the west, Buller assigned Lord Methuen to advance towards Kimberley and break the siege of the town. In Cape Colony, Buller ordered Lieutenant General William Gatacre to secure the Cape Midland area against marauding Boers. Finally, Buller himself would lead the bulk of the Army Corps into Natal to relieve the British Army at Ladysmith. Buller has been criticised for dividing his force in this manner, but given the circumstances and time pressure which he faced, it is very difficult to see what other options lay open to him. However, in the process of splitting the force, numerous organisational problems emerged. The army was deployed in dribs and drabs as they arrived in South Africa. Battalions were separated from their parent brigades, and these brigades were separated from their parent divisions. Units who were not familiar with one another had to learn to work together in the field, and time was desperately short. Staff officers, the nervous system of any army, were in short supply, and this made the reorganisation all the more difficult. The British advance was hampered by several related factors. Firstly, there was the problem of time. The besieged towns could not hold out indefinitely, and therefore the British had to advance to the attack. But here the second problem emerged. There was little possibility of achieving surprise. The Boers knew that the British were coming and could prepare defensive positions to block their advance. Furthermore, the Boers could predict the direction from which the British would advance, for the British army was dependent upon the rail lines for its supplies, and this forced the army to advance along predictable axes. The Boers could therefore prepare defensive positions, entrenching themselves in the path of the British army. Fighting its way through these positions was an unenviable task in the face of Boer firepower. It was against this background that the British Army fought 3 battles in December 1899. William Gatacre's force, operating in the Cape Midlands, was the smallest and the weakest of the British armies, but it was also facing the lightest opposition. Gatacre was no fool. He had a well-deserved reputation for toughness and expected his men to live up to his own hard physical standards, earning himself the nickname of General Backacre in the process. He also understood the need to achieve surprise against the Boers. His force was too small to endure a prolonged or attritional battle against them. Instead, he planned to march his army into position under cover of darkness and then surprise the Boers with a sudden dawn attack. In principle, this was a reasonable plan. In practice, it was exceptionally ambitious. Gatacre proposed to march his force 8 miles in complete darkness over rough terrain, guided only by a handful of crude maps and the knowledge of local guides. At 9:15 p.m. on the 9th of December, the march began. Progress was slow and the experience was disorientating. The infantry, ordered to march in silence with bayonets fixed, became tired and dispirited. Worse still, unknowingly, Gatacre's force veered off its intended course and took a circuitous route over hills, through valleys and across dirt tracks. By midnight, the column was hopelessly lost. Dawn broke at 4:15 a.m. and cast much needed light on the situation. But to Gatacre's horror, he realised he has led his men not into a position from which to launch an attack, but instead into the very heart of the Boer lines. The Boers, initially startled, reacted first and quickly poured fire into the confused British troops. The British bravely rushed to the attack, but it was a hopeless contest. The troops were without sleep and had no rations. There was no organisation, no reconnaissance and no plan. The Boers held firm, and within half an hour it was clear that the attack was doomed. Exhausted British soldiers recoiled from the Boer fire, and Gatacre was forced to order a general retreat. In the confusion, over 600 soldiers were left behind when they received no orders to withdraw, and all of these men became Boer prisoners. Gatacre's force stumbled away. Exhausted, bloodied and wrecked, the Cape Midlands had not been secured. The shambolic engagement would become known as the Battle of Stormberg. It was a startling defeat, but worse was yet to come. In the west, Lord Methuen had been experiencing some success fighting his way forwards towards Kimberley. He had driven the Boers back several times in late November and had successfully crossed the Modder River, the last major natural obstacle between him and the diamond mining town, which now lay some 20 miles distant. Methuen's tactical methods were simple. He used his heavy artillery to undertake powerful preliminary bombardments and then followed it up with vigorous infantry attacks, which drove the Boers from their positions. The method had worked, albeit at some cost in casualties, during engagements in late November. By now, the Boers had fallen back to Magersfontein, where they proposed to make another stand. But how could they stop this relentless British advance? The answer came from Boer commander Coeurs de la Rey. He had recognised that digging in on high ground merely made the commandos perfect targets for British artillery. He proposed something different. Rather than digging in on the high ground, the Boers would only leave dummy emplacements there to attract the British eye. They would actually construct their main position at the base of the Kop and carefully camouflage it to avoid British reconnaissance. Abandoning the high ground like this went against all conventional theories of war, but it offered the Boers some distinct advantages. By carefully camouflaging the line, they would be invisible and would be able to ambush the British as they approached. Furthermore, the position gave the Boers a superb field of fire over the flat plain that lay in front of them, allowing them to decimate any British advance that approached the Kop. Lord Methuen and his fellow officers fell into the trap. The Boer position was so carefully concealed that it entirely eluded British reconnaissance. On the 10th of December, the Royal Artillery carried out a 2-hour bombardment of the Kop, the heaviest bombardment delivered by British guns since the Battle of Sevastopol in the Crimean War in the 1850s. But the shelling was directed against dummy positions and did nothing but alert the Boers that an attack was imminent. Total Boer casualties during this preliminary bombardment were a mere 3 men wounded. In a similar manner to Gatacre, Methuen planned to advance his troops under cover of darkness so that they would be in position to launch an assault as soon as dawn broke. It was approximately 3 miles from the British line to Magersfontein Kop, considerably shorter than the distance attempted by Gatacre. But the movement was over broken ground and undertaken in the midst of a terrific rainstorm which made visibility zero. Without moonlight to guide them, the British soldiers were blinded and lashed by wind and rain. They made agonisingly slow progress during the night. When dawn broke on the 11th of December, they were still around 500 yards short at the base of Magersfontein Kop, but within lethal range of the concealed Boer marksmen. The Scots of the Highland Brigade had led the night march. Still formed in close column as dawn broke, they were now swept by a devastating fusillade from the previously undiscovered Boer trenches. Attempts to rush forward across the open ground were fruitless. The ground was so open that they could not fall back. The brigade was left trapped, pinned down by Boer rifle and artillery fire, and exposed to a merciless South African sun for the next 12 hours. Lord Methuen pushed up reinforcements to try and turn the flanks of the Boer position, but these attacks were beaten back. At 4 p.m, after 12 hours of enduring Boer fire and merciless heat, the Highland Brigade finally broke and retreated in disorder. Their hasty withdrawal marked the end of the battle, and Lord Methuen made no further attacks. His force had suffered 948 men killed and wounded, of whom 747 were men of the Highland Brigade. The advance on Kimberley had been brought to a bloody, shuddering halt. News of Gatacre's and Methuen's defeats soon reached Redvers Buller in Natal and must have added to his own worries. In front of him, the Boers had taken a powerful defensive position on the opposite side of the Tugela River at Colenso, blocking the road to Ladysmith. Time was short, and news of the defeats elsewhere must have made it seem shorter still, and thus Buller decided he did not have the opportunity to outmanoeuvre the Boers. Instead, he would have to launch a direct assault that fought its way across the river, opened the road to Ladysmith and relieved the besieged garrison. The Boers at Colenso were commanded by 37-year-old Louis Bertha. Bertha, like Delaray and Magersfontein, had decided not to occupy the high ground, except with dummy positions. Instead, he dug in on the riverbanks of the Tugela, placing his commandos opposite the fords which the British would have to fight their way across. He planned to ambush the British as they struggled through the water. Perfectly concealed, the Boer trenches here evaded British reconnaissance. Buller, observing the position, decided that the only way that his forces could cross this river was after a strong preliminary bombardment. He recognised the difficulty of a river assault and ordered his artillery to prepare the way. As such, his artillery carried out a 2-day bombardment, but mainly targeted the dummy positions on Colenso itself, having not identified the main Boer position on the riverbank. The failure to find the Boer trenches meant that most of the bombardment fell harmlessly onto dummy emplacements and unoccupied areas. On the 15th of December, Buller's force rolled into action. Things immediately went wrong. Colonel Charles Long, the man who had promised to rush in on them when asked about his tactical approach on the voyage to South Africa, did just that. Charging forward with a dozen of his guns, some say to within 300 yards of the Boer lines and certainly within 1,000. His batteries were immediately swept by rifle bullets. Long himself fell wounded, and after an unequal firefight lasting about an hour, the crews were forced to abandon their guns in the field. Whilst Long's batteries were being destroyed, the infantry attack was experiencing an equal disaster. The assault was spearheaded by Fitzroy Hart's Irish Brigade. Hart was an experienced brigadier and considered one of the best in the British Army before the war. But in South Africa, his senses appeared to have deserted him. His bizarre performance was later attributed to delirium caused by sunstroke. At Colenso, he advanced his Irish Brigade in old-fashioned shoulder-to-shoulder formation, denying requests from his subordinates to shake out into open-order battle lines. To add to the problems, the brigade became disorientated as it approached the river, veering off its intended course and instead marching it into a loop of the river where it could be engaged from 3 sides. This was a gift to the Boers, who seized the opportunity to pour murderous fire into the helpless Irishmen. Hart resolutely pushed his brigade forward, still denying his troops the opportunity to open into skirmish formation, although his subordinate officers simply ignored these demands. But the task was hopeless. Buller commented with quiet understatement that Hart had got himself into a devil of a mess. The destruction of Long's batteries and the imminent destruction of the Irish Brigade was too much for Buller, who ordered Hart to fall back and provided covering fire from Neville Littleton's brigade to protect the movement. Littleton had fought at both Omdurman and Colenso and left an evocative description of the differences between the 2 battles. Littleton wrote after the war, "Few people have seen 2 battles in succession in such stark contrast as Omdurman and Colenso. In the first, 50,000 fanatics streamed across the open regardless of cover to certain death. While at Colenso, I never saw a Boer all day till the battle was over, and it was our men who were the victims." Within 2 hours of the opening of the Battle of Colenso, the conflict was effectively over. Buller, disheartened by his early disasters, lost hope of breaking the Boer lines and instead concentrated on rescuing Long's abandoned guns. 12 guns were left in the field. If these were to be lost, it would represent the greatest loss of guns suffered by the Royal Artillery since the Napoleonic Wars, and a grave humiliation to the British Army. 4 valiant efforts were made to pull the guns away, each one opposed by murderous Boer rifle and artillery fire. 2 guns were removed, but the cost in lives was high, one of the casualties being Frederick Roberts, the only son of the great Field Marshal Lord Roberts, Frederick Roberts falling mortally wounded during the first attempt to rescue the guns. By 11 a.m, after the 4th attempt to rescue the guns had failed, Buller decided that further efforts were futile. 10 guns, one of which was disabled, were left behind and were carried away by the Boers at the end of the day. It was the worst loss of guns experienced by the Royal Artillery in decades. Furthermore, Buller's army had lost 1,138 men killed, wounded and missing. In comparison, the Boers had lost 8 men killed and 30 wounded. It was a comprehensive British defeat. The Battle of Stormberg on the 10th of December, Magersfontein on the 11th of December and Colenso on the 15th of December cost the British a total of 2,876 battle casualties. To put this into context, this was a comparable figure to the total battlefield losses that had been suffered in the Zulu War and the Second Afghan War combined, and these casualties had been suffered in just a single week in South Africa. The British advance had been stopped dead in its tracks on all fronts, and the fate of the besieged towns was uncertain. The price of pre-war hubris had been paid in full. When news of the disasters reached Britain, the Liberal MP and future Prime Minister Herbert Asquith christened it a Black Week. The press quickly adopted this phrase and carried shocked and sensational accounts of the British defeats. The nation was at first stunned and then embarrassed. How could the might of the British Army be humbled by the untrained farmers of South Africa? The feeling was worsened by a wave of schadenfreude emanating from France, Germany and Russia, who took great delight in seeing the British humiliated in South Africa. Yet once the initial shame had faded, the country responded with a newfound determination to see the war to its conclusion. Christmas and January were characterised by a wave of popular support for the war as volunteers flocked to the colours, not merely in Britain but also in the dominions of Canada, Australia and New Zealand. What had begun as just another small colonial war had metamorphosised into a national and an imperial struggle. Ironically then, the Boers may have doomed themselves with their victories in Black Week. The British government, shamed at home and abroad, reacted not by seeking peace, but by redoubling their efforts to win the war. But it would take much hard fighting and 2 years of further conflict before this goal would be achieved. You can read more about how the British Army learned from its defeats in Black Week in my book, From Boer War to World War, and how this influenced the army in the First World War in my books, Stemming the Tide and Courage Without Glory.